If the Jets trade for Aaron Rodgers, they are all in trying to win a Super Bowl. What do they need to do to put a championship team around Rodgers? We'll talk about it today on the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, this is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Thursday, March 9th, 2023, and I'm your host, John B. from GangrenNation.com, thanking you for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help the channel out and help other Jets fans find the podcast. And today our episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of the NFL. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon today to get started. Well, of course, the Jets are very much in the mix for superstar quarterback Aaron Rodgers, and I think it's pretty clear that if they make a trade for Rodgers, they are all in trying to win a Super Bowl. So what do the Jets need to do to put a Super Bowl team around Rodgers? That's what we're going to talk about on today's episode. Now, why do I say the Jets are all in for a Super Bowl if they trade for Rodgers? Well, he's 40 years old. You're probably talking about giving up some sort of asset for him. Now, we don't know exactly what that's going to be, but we could probably figure that there's going to be some sort of early draft pick. It may be a day 2 pick. It may be a first day pick. It may be multiple picks, but the Jets are going to give up some sort of asset for him. But beyond that, Rodgers is approaching 40, so he doesn't have much time left. You're giving up something appreciable for him. He's got an enormous salary, too. And maybe, I don't know, maybe the Jets can work something out to cut his salary, but I think it's going to be tough. I think it's going to be awfully tough because the Jets really want him. And if you're Rodgers at this point of your career, you don't really need to play. You know, you've probably got enough money saved to take care of yourself for several lifetimes. So why do you need to take a pay cut to come play for the Jets? You know, the Jets really want you badly. They're going to take you without a pay cut probably. So everything is set up now for Rodgers to come to the Jets on his full salary. And with all that in mind, you don't make this kind of an investment for a short-term player. And I think it's fair to say that we probably would be looking at most 2 years of Rodgers. It may be 1. I don't think it's going to be 3. I think when you look at the way players age, asking him to play at a high level at 42, 43, it's an awful... I know what happened with Tom Brady. I think it's a lot to ask. I mean, even in his early 40s, even in his 40, 41-year-old seasons, it's still a lot to ask, but I think if you get 2 great years out of him and he returns to his MVP form, that's probably the best case scenario for the Jets. So you got to win the championship in these 2 years. You know, this is a short-term move. This is not a move about long-term building. This is all about the here and now. It's a move you're trying to essentially make your version of Tampa Bay getting Tom Brady or the Rams getting Matthew Stafford. With that in mind, I mean, you cannot halfway this if you're the Jets. You have to go all in. You know, what's the point of trading for Rodgers if you're not going all in for a Super Bowl? Now, my personal view on this, as you may know if you've been listening over the last couple of weeks, last couple of months since the offseason began, I don't know that this is necessarily the most prudent course for the Jets, but listen, if you're going to get Rodgers, you might as well go for it. So what does that mean? Well, I think you're going to see a lot of deals renegotiated to begin with, because the Jets actually got themselves under the salary cap a couple of days ago when they restructured the deal of CJ Uzomah. And essentially what they did at that point was they took some of what was going to be his salary for the season and they converted it to signing bonus. Now, what does that mean? Well, essentially what it means is that if your base salary is something that you are paid over 17 installments during the NFL season. You get a game check after each game. So after each game you get a check, whatever your salary is, divided by 17 because there are 17 games. When that money is converted to a signing bonus, you essentially get a big payment up front. You get your signing bonus is typically paid within a few weeks. It's negotiated exactly when it's paid, but it's just a bonus check that's sent to you. So the player is always going to agree to it, because essentially what you're saying is that, you know, all that money you were going to have to wait for in 17 installments in the fall and the winter, we'll just give it to you right now in one big check. It's always in the player's interest to take that. So the player's always going to be willing to do that. But what it does to your cap number is it lowers it in the short term, because the way signing bonus money works is that the cap hit is spread out over the lifetime of the contract. So let's say I give you a $5 million signing bonus on a 5-year contract. You get the $5 million. You get the full $5 million of that signing bonus right now. I give you a $5 million check. But the way it is accounted over the course of the deal is you are charged $1 million per year for each of the 5 years of the contract. Now that money does not go away. You eventually do have to pay that against the cap. So that's money that you are adding to your future cap, and you cannot take that money away. Because the way the salary cap works is, essentially the easiest way I could put it is, over the long run, over the course of multiple years, every dollar you pay a player is eventually charged against your cap. Again, but you can manipulate the cap and essentially lower your hit this year in exchange for increasing it by the same amount in the future. And that's essentially what the Jets did with CJ Uzomah. And that move got them under the cap, but they're going to have to make several more moves to create the kind of space to add any sort of player of importance. And that includes Aaron Rodgers. That includes the quarterback. And in fact, the way Rodgers' deal is structured this year is essentially for all intents and purposes, he kind of gets a signing bonus when the team decides we want to keep him around. So essentially he gets for all intents and purposes, it's a $60 million contract, but there are 4 years left in his contract. So essentially he gets almost the full $60 million up front, and then over the next 4 years, you're charged $15 million a year. So that's how that works. I think what the Jets are going to do is the Jets are going to create as much short-term cap space as they can, and they'll just kick all these cap hits to the future. And, in a couple of years, it may get kind of painful. But again, if you're getting Rodgers, you're not sitting around trying to go to the divisional round of the playoffs. Because what's the point of that? Because, I just told you, you're pushing $45 million worth of cap hit into the future by getting him. You're going to push $45 million of cap hit for 1 year where maybe you go to the wild card or the divisional round? No, you got to go all in. And that's why I say this. This is an all-in move if the Jets make it. And at this point in time, at least at the time we're recording, it seems like there's a very realistic possibility that this is going to happen. So, you look at some of the contracts the Jets could restructure. One of them, much to my chagrin, but I think it could happen, is C.J. Mosley, a $17 million base salary. So, you convert some of that to signing bonus, you kick some of that $17 million, you can get quite a bit of that $17 million down the road. You got Laken Tomlinson, a $12.7 million base salary this year. Kick some of that down the road. Carl Lawson's a little bit trickier because he's in the last year of his contract, but you can also add what are known as void years to the deal. Void years are essentially years after the contract has expired, but you can still kick your cap hits those years. So essentially what happens is the player is cut automatically, so he's off your team, but the player still counts against your cap. But to do that, in exchange for that, you get short-term cap relief. So those are 3 players right there. And you may say, well, they could cut Carl Lawson for $15 million worth of savings. Well, you know something? If you're going all in, I think that changes the calculus on somebody like Carl Lawson. I think that you are now saying we got to win a championship, so Carl Lawson sticks around. So I think that's the strategy you'll see from the Jets to create as much cap space as possible. There are other players they could restructure, but you get the idea. Essentially, we're going to lower a bunch of players' cap hits this year in exchange for short-term flexibility, in exchange for more money counting against them in the future. Now, what are the Jets going to do with this money? That's the big question, because they have a roster to fill out. And I think the priority number one, if you get Aaron Rodgers, is you got to build a good offensive line around him. What can the Jets do? How can they do it? We'll discuss this further as we continue this Thursday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Of course, if the Jets are able to trade for Aaron Rodgers, they will improve their Super Bowl odds, but the NFL season's still a few months off. We are, however, in the middle of the NBA season, and it's the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from the money line to point scorers and threes drained. Plus, FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a bigger payout with a same-game parlay. So don't miss the chance to get your no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. Thank you for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. Today we're talking Aaron Rodgers. And we're not just talking Aaron Rodgers, we're talking trying to win the Super Bowl if the Jets trade for Aaron Rodgers, because if you're trading for Aaron Rodgers, you are going all in. And to make this a successful deal, the Jets have to win the Super Bowl in the next 2 years. So what can they do to make it happen? Well, in the first segment, I took you through the finances. The Jets essentially need to clear out as much cap space as they can in the short run. They need to load this team with as much talent as possible. But they especially need to focus on the offensive line. Now, through his career, Rodgers has been a pretty mobile quarterback. He's been a guy with a lot of playmaking ability. One of the things that's been so special is his work outside the pocket, where he's been able to throw on the run as well as any quarterback ever has that big arm. But, as he gets older, I think as any quarterback gets older, you want to be able to protect him. And Aaron Rodgers, through much of his career, has had some excellent players on the offensive line, most notably David Bakhtiari, who's been a tremendous left tackle through much of Rodgers' career. And the Jets I don't think the Jets want to go to battle in the 2023 season with Aaron Rodgers at quarterback and what they currently have on the offensive line. Now, Dwayne Brown indicated that he wants to come back a few days back. We'll see what happens there. Robert Saleh indicated that they want to bring Brown back. Now, Brown's been an excellent player through his career, but I think he's clearly near the end of the line. Mekhi Becton, what can you really expect from him? Max Mitchell, we don't know what we have in him. I don't think it would be a great idea to expect Max Mitchell to step right in and be a quality starter. I think he's one of those players. I think there are players where you need to count on them, and then there are players where you give them a shot, and if they surprise you, you're happy and you figure out a way to make it work. I don't think Max Mitchell's a guy you want. I don't think he's a guy you want to count on. I think he's a guy you give him. If he surprises you, then that's great, and he's good depth. I don't know that I want to count on him being a starting player. And then you have Elijah Vera Tucker, who acquitted himself pretty well playing the tackle position for a couple games in 2022. That said, I think coming out of school, most people and even the Jets thought he's a better fit at guard. Now, there was an argument to be made that maybe he could play tackle. He did play well in those 3 games. He saw the tackle position. But if we're going all in, go all in. Let's get a guy we know can play tackle. We'll move Vera Tucker back to guard, where he was playing very well last year, and essentially try and build as good of an offensive line as possible. Now, who could the Jets go get? Well, there are some options out there. Orlando Brown, a tremendous tackle. He's played with Baltimore. He's now played with Kansas City. He looks like he's going to be available. So he's a guy, if we're talking about a big money deal, that's a guy the Jets could go out and get. If you want a premium tackle blocking for Aaron Rodgers, that's a guy that, that's a pretty obvious choice. But, there are some other options out there. We could also talk about, a guy from the San Francisco 49ers, Mike McGlinchey, who's been a pretty solid player through much of his career. But there's another option out there, and it could be David Bakhtiari. Now, this is an interesting spot for the Green Bay Packers because Bakhtiari is one of those guys who's been rumored as a potential cap cut for Green Bay. It's difficult to say what they're going to do. On the one hand, he's a guy who maybe if you're moving on from Rodgers, you let go, you start a new era. Maybe you move on from him. On the other hand, maybe you want him blocking for Jordan Love, because if Rodgers is traded from Green Bay, obviously Jordan Love is the favorite to take over as the starting quarterback there. It'll be his first year as a starting quarterback. He started a couple games for Green Bay, he's seen playing time here or there, doesn't have a lot of experience. So you're going with a young quarterback like a Jordan Love, maybe you want to make sure he has top-notch protection. Now, I think if Bakhtiari left Green Bay and the Jets got Rodgers, they would obviously be the favorites to land his services. And essentially, you'd see like one of these situations. You see it across sports. You've seen it with teams LeBron James has played on. You saw it with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers with Brady. You've seen it in a number of spots where you just have the one superstar player who kind of pulls big-time players to join him. Big names, guys who are friends with him. Essentially, these teams load up and they try and make a run. And I feel like that's the obvious spot for Bakhtiari. And I think Rodgers could do it for a couple other guys. I think there's a very good chance Randall Cobb comes to the Jets if Rodgers is here. Alan Lazard, we'll see. I don't know what the Jets would do that. I kind of hope they don't, because Alan Lazard is a guy who is yet to produce an 800-yard season in the NFL. He's had Rodgers throwing to him, so it's not like he's got this amazing chemistry with Rodgers. It's not like he's shown not like he's got a great resume of production. It's not like he's had a bad quarterback throwing to him because he's had Rodgers throwing to him this whole time. But if Rodgers wants him, I think one thing that's clear is that Rodgers is going to get what he wants. So if he likes Alan Lazard, if he likes Randall Cobb, and if Bakhtiari becomes free, I would expect the Jets to be in on all these guys. I think they'll see a lot of imports from Green Bay, and maybe one or two of these guys, like especially Bakhtiari, can help fix the offensive line because that's something you're going to want to do with Rodgers. You're not going to want to put him behind a shaky offensive line. And Bakhtiari kind of makes sense from another standpoint, a big name. And I think that's another thing that Rodgers could attract to the Jets. As we continue on this Thursday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about some of the players he could bring into the Jets, veteran players near the end of their careers who could be chasing another ring. We'll talk about who some of those guys could be ahead here on this Thursday podcast episode. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Thursday. We're talking about what happens if the Jets trade for Aaron Rodgers. And my view is that if you make the trade, you got to go all in because a trade for Rodgers really is an all-in move. When you're acquiring a star quarterback who's approaching his 40s, there's no other way to put it. You got to try and win the Super Bowl immediately, especially when you're giving up major resources. We can presume that a trade is going to lead to the Jets parting with some sort of early draft pick or some package of picks. We also know that Rodgers has a huge contract, a contract that likely will leave the Jets with quite a bit of dead money in a few years after he's retired. This is the time to make the move then. So we've talked about how the Jets will create short-term cap space. We've talked about the need for them to improve the offensive line. And I kind of led into this by talking about David Bakhtiari. And I think what will happen with Rodgers is the Jets are going to try and bring in a lot of veteran players, some big-name guys near the end of their careers. Some guys who have probably already won rings, but guys who want one last shot at the championship, one last shot to play on a team with a lot of big names. So I'm thinking guys like one guy who comes to mind for me that I think would be likely to come to the Jets, maybe I'm wrong on this, is Odell Beckham Jr., who, of course, we haven't seen on the field in a long time, and of course has a Super Bowl ring, but Rodgers in the past has expressed an interest in playing with Beckham. And listen, we know that the Jets, after you get past Garrett Wilson, and we can exclude Garrett Wilson from this, but the Jets have some issues at the receiver position after Garrett Wilson. I mean, Corey Davis is okay. He's nothing great though, and he hasn't been able to stay on the field for the team. He's a decent value for the money he's getting, but he's probably a number 3 type receiver. A year ago I may have said he's a second guy. I think maybe he's more of a number 3 guy right now. So that's the type of guy I think the Jets could bring in. You look at the defensive side of the ball, one of the weak points is the linebacker position. And of course, the Jets are very happy with what they have in Quincy Williams, but Bobby Wagner is a guy who's a free agent right now. Would I be shocked to see the Jets go out and get a Bobby Wagner? Maybe, I don't know, Levante David. A big name like that. Somebody who could improve the linebacker position, slot in next to C.J. Mosley. These are the types of moves I think the Jets are going to make. I think they're going to look for guys who maybe are not going to be the top dollar players, maybe not necessarily the guys who reset the value at a market, guys who maybe reset the value at their position contractually years ago, but guys who are big names, guys who they think still have something to offer, guys who Rodgers, and I think that's one of the things with Rodgers is there are not many players who can help attract free agents, and it's unclear whether Rodgers can do that himself, but near the end of his career, are there going to be players who want to win a ring? Are there going to be guys who want to play on a team with a lot of other big stars? Are there going to be guys who want to play with Rodgers? Guys who want their last memory on the football field to potentially be winning a Super Bowl with Aaron Rodgers? Jets are going to be the team that attracts those players. And you've seen this over the last couple of years. You especially saw it with Brady in Tampa Bay, where they just brought in big name after big name. These guys were not the players they were in their primes. Rob Gronkowski is a great example. Was Gronk a Hall of Fame type player with Tampa Bay? I don't think so. I don't think he was anywhere close to the player he was in New England. But you add enough of these guys to the stars you already have, and the Jets have an outstanding core of young players. When you've got Garrett Wilson, you've got Sauce Gardner and Breece Hall, and there are some other solid players. Some role players like Michael Carter II on this team. So they already have the core of young talent. Now, if you can fill in some big veteran names, now again, 2 or 3 years down the line, this situation could get kind of rough for the Jets. But if this is that's probably going to be the case anyway with Rodgers. So I just don't think you can halfway this situation. I think that if you're going all in with Rodgers, and I think you're absolutely going all in if you get him, you maximize your opportunity. Even I think one of the things is like you can't really moderate something like this. You can't say, well, we'll hurt ourselves a little bit in the future for Rodgers, but we won't really go all the way now. That's not how it works. So I think that's what needs to happen. The Jets will just clear out short-term cap space. They will address the big needs, especially the offensive line, because you got to protect this guy. If you're going out and getting this guy and giving him $60 million a year, even though he's a guy who's been able to move for much of his career, you got to make sure you protect him. And then I think like some of these guys, the former stars, are going to step in and be role players for the Jets. Maybe the guys who can help get you over the hump, get you to a championship. This is like the path I see for the Jets. Will it be enough? I don't know, but I think you got at this point you say that's probably the path that gives you the best shot at winning the Super Bowl. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, but please a big thumbs up. These things help the channel out and help other Jets fans find the podcast. Have a great Thursday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to close out the week.